Welcome to the pandemic-friendly Cloud City Meetup. Our mission is to collect advice from tomorrow's leaders to help from today's leaders to help tomorrow's pioneers push the technology frontier. I'm Chris Kelly, and along with Charles Fitzgerald, who is at the Zoom controls, we are the organizers. Charles and I are technology enthusiasts and somewhat irreverent angel investors here in Seattle. We are coming to you live and direct from Seattle, Cloud City, and we have now moved the show to the cloud to decouple us from geography. Our guest today is Bangaly Kaba. Bangaly currently is an executive in residence with Reforge, the leading career development company for tech professionals. He was most recently a VP of product management at Instacart, where he led the growth in consumer organizations that built much of the company's core functions. Prior to Instacart, Bangaly worked for 4.5 years at Facebook. His last role there was at the head of growth at Instagram, where he and his teams grew Instagram to over 1 billion monthly active users, making it one of the world's fastest growing apps. Bangaly's career prior to Facebook spanned multiple industries, including working in education as a dean of a boarding school in Switzerland, and in finance at Lehman, which we'll dig into in a minute. I have a few questions for Bangaly, and then we'll throw it open. To submit a question, please use the Zoom Q&A button. And as always, please go to feedback.cloudcitymeetup.com to let us know how we're doing. Bangaly, thank you so much for joining us. I would love to talk about your background for just a minute. You started your career as a professor and then dean at a Swiss boarding school, and then went into finance in the teeth of the financial crisis. How did you then make the jump to tech?
Yeah, so thanks for having me. Great to be here. I started my career in education. It was an interesting path. I graduated during one recession and then transitioned to finance in another recession. And so, I think, my path to tech was actually kind of like it feels maybe a little circuitous to me. I guess, everything in hindsight's 2020, it was like pretty clear. So I grew up, not to date myself, but a kid of the 90s building. I was an only child in DC. Used to build computers, back when like that was a thing, and like programming in Visual Basic, administrative bulletin boards, tying up my parents' phone lines. And like tech, especially on the East Coast, wasn't really a thing then. And so I always kind of had this kind of like itch, but there was like no real path. And so, when I, in the 2000s, when I was in education and then went to business school, I'd been really following, there was like kind of the rise of Blogger and just blogs at that point. And there was just like this kind of unprecedented transparency about what was happening in Silicon Valley. All of the like companies that were getting built. I remember vividly reading this blog called Googlers, like ex-Googlers, about like their time at Google. And so for me, it was like, oh, this is like super interesting. I really want to be in this space, but like, I don't know how to make it work. Fast forward to like, I joined Lehman Brothers, as a summer intern, the summer that they actually went bankrupt, which was an incredible story. Ended up working in Barclays Capital and asset management. And some of my customers and prospective customers were in tech, and they were like, you really know this business, like you really live it, love it, like you should think about going and doing your own startup. And I eventually like decided to actually do that. Like, I had this kind of tragic event in my family where my mom passed away, and I was reconsidering kind of what I wanted to be doing in life, and made a decision at that point that like I wanted to quit and start my own startup. And I just, I kind of felt that like I could do it, I could figure it out. Maybe it was naive at the time, but certainly like I felt like with the rise of WordPress, a rise of a lot of like, the platformization of like the internet in some ways, like I felt like the barriers to entry and building a company were as low as they ever had been. And I had, some ideas that I wanted to wrestle through, and I just decided to go and do it.
What gave you, I want to explore that feeling a little bit of that you actually could do it, because that's a lot of what our audience will face sometimes. Were there any other specific tactical elements, physical, emotional, that gave you that courage to go jump forward?
It's a great question. I mean, I'd just gone through in a series of years, I'd gone from being a dean of a boarding school in Switzerland. And in that time, like, I had, faced a bunch of like hard challenges, was living in a country where I had to learn a new language. I had to learn Italian while I was there. I went to business school. I was, as I mentioned, a summer associate at Lehman, and I literally, my last day at Lehman was August 15th, 2008, and Lehman went bankrupt September 15th, 2008. And then, I was working at Barclays, my mom passed away. I just seen a bunch of like just really challenging moments. And, people tell you this, but like, you live through these hard things and, you know, you learn that like you will be okay. Like, life will never be the same, but you will be okay. And like that really kind of stuck with me of like, I can go and try this thing and maybe I will fail, but I will be okay.
Mhm,
But
mhm.
like, your network of the people who know you, who believe in you and trust you will help you to find what's next. Right. But like, I never wanted to be in a situation where if I didn't try it, I would forever regret it.
Yeah.
Right. And so I went from the situation of making a very healthy salary, money on Wall Street to like starting my own company, raising a little bit of money, kind of like going broke, having a ton of credit card debt, having to like build a team, but then also lay off the team after a couple of years. And like it felt hard, I'm not gonna lie. Like a lot of people tell the glory stories of startups that are unicorns, but no one's telling the stories of most startups which are not unicorns that end up failing.
Mhm.
And the reality matters, like in the US, you never really learn failure,
Yeah.
right? Like in school, you're spending time, trying to get the next best grades and get to the next level, or you're entering the corporate ranks and trying to get to like from associate to, assistant to associate to full, whatever it is.
Mhm.
And, there's nothing like starting your own company, employing people, being responsible for their livelihood and having to shut down your company.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so, that was another thing that I had to endure, but like, I worked my ass off to make sure that everyone on my team landed in a good place.
Yeah.
And I was ultimately okay. And it was like character building for me,
Yeah.
but also helped me create like a lot of empathy for what the founder experience is.
Yep. No, I can reflect that. Um, what pulled you as you started to get into tech? What pulled your focus towards product and growth specifically?
Yeah, I mean, as a founder, you do all the things, you wear all the hats, right? So you're doing some biz ops, you're doing some operations, some marketing, some product, a little bit of engineering I had to do. And, when my startup eventually like, kind of closed, I had to like choose what was I most excited about.
Mhm.
What did I think like my skills and my talents would be like most applicable to? And product felt like the thing that was that best fits kind of like my personality.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is like, you know, a lot of times recruiters, for example, will reach out to me and say, hey, like you in education, and then you were like in a product executive now. How do these two things connect? And I tell them the story that like, look, fundamentally, these jobs are actually very similar.
Mhm. Mhm.
Like as a product leader, nobody owes you anything. You oftentimes have to corral a chorus of people towards a shared goal and a shared vision and lead through influence.
Mhm. Mhm.
And your success in product is dependent on your ability to communicate clearly, to build trust and strong relationships, and to get people aligned on a shared mission and to execute. And the same is exactly true as an educator. Right?
Mhm.
Like you're walking into a classroom, the
Mhm.
hardest thing I ever did was to get 24 7-year-olds to believe in the vision I was selling them for 230 days a year and to get their parents on board with that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? It's a lot easier. It was a lot harder to do that than to get like Kevin Systrom and Mike Krieger, who are like completely rational human beings, to believe in a strategy for like growing the next 100 million people on Instagram.
Totally. Totally. Everybody's aligned at a kind, or at least in theory,
Right.
going in the same direction.
Right, right. And so like those skills are the same. It's like you have to lead through influence. You have to be a clear communicator. You have to build trust. Like all of these skills are the same.
Got it.
And so, that was the thing that kind of like made me excited for product when I realized it. It's like, oh, these are skills that I already have, but I'm applying them into a different domain. So I just need the domain expertise to make it work. And growth was a thing that I got into because, I ended up joining Facebook after my startup closed. And I frankly only expected to be there for about a year and a half to 2 years. And
Mhm.
so my thinking at the time was, what team can I join? What skill can I get that if I leave Facebook, it's going to be applicable well beyond my time at Facebook,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? And you can't really teach product market fit, but growth and like monetization are things that are like hard skills that like can apply to a lot of different places. So I was like, all right, let me learn growth, because like if I go do another startup, then like, I'll have that skill. And I ended up staying in it a lot longer than I expected.
Yeah, and we're obviously successful. You learned the growth lessons well, clearly from your record, and I want to come back to that in a minute. Were there any other things that were particularly challenging to learn as you bridged into tech that you would give people advice to go focus on if they're looking to make a similar jump?
Yeah, I mean, so I think one thing that's, so I think there's two things that are really hard that like, you know, things that really just don't ever get explicitly taught. So one is product sense and the other strategy,
Mhm.
right? Like product sense is like, how do you think through what it means to create a great product, and like create a great product for and solve a real customer need for a customer, like within the product. And this is something that like all tech companies want to assess you on, but like is rarely ever taught explicitly in many places. And so I think that becomes really hard, because everyone I think is an armchair quarterback when it comes to like criticizing an app. But very few people have like great product sense to be
Mhm.
able to talk about, well, you can criticize it, but like, how do you actually deconstruct what that really means? Like what segmentation they're focusing on, what jobs are they solving in this, and why does it not solve that job well? What jobs should they be solving for customers? And what does that mean for like the way this app should look and feel?
Mhm.
Right?
Mhm.
These are things that like I think you learn from being in a place that has like strong leadership and strong like product culture,
Mhm.
and then also like being curious,
Mhm.
right? And like you almost have to be obsessive, like with anything where you're going to be great at, like you need to be obsessive.
Yeah.
And so by obsessive, I mean like, I would spend time just like looking through apps and like coming up with a POV of like, is this app good? What makes it good? What makes it bad? How would I improve it? Like, and talking to people about it, hearing
Gotcha.
other people's, learning from other people. I think that's a thing. And then strategy is a similar thing. Like it's one thing to come up with a feature. It's another thing to think like longitudinally about like, where's the world going? Where's our product need to go? And like, how do we get there?
Gotcha. Gotcha. That's super helpful. That's really interesting. I'd love to dig into one of those sort of hard lessons, if you will, and maybe become a little bit obsessive. I want to set the stage first to talk about some of this growth work that you did. Let's put ourselves in the mode. It's 2016. Instagram is coming from a wild success, getting to about 400 million users, but
Yep.
growth is slow. Growth is linear. You're new to the Instagram team. You're coming in as a PM leader. You were on another critical Facebook growth team, but put us in your shoes. How did you assess the sort of mood in the room on this new team that you were joining?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. So it was an interesting time. The growth team at that time was, I think, about 30 people. It's cross-functional. So I think there was maybe one other product person, maybe two at the time. Um, one designer, one data scientist, a growth marketer, and about 18 engineers, something like that. And the team was a really smart team, but I don't think that I wouldn't say they had the rigor to like of like great growth at that point in time.
Mhm.
And so, me reading the room was understanding like, who are the people on this team and what are they excited about? How do I win their trust? Like, how do I help them to see the opportunity that lays in front of us, but also get them aligned so we're working on the right things in the right way?
Mhm.
That was one component. And then the other side of the coin was like, to what extent do I like, how do I need to get Kevin and Mikey like to believe in what we're doing?
Mhm.
Right. And that, like, how do you get executive buy-in?
Yeah.
And so fortunately for me, I think Kevin and Mikey were like certainly concerned about like us building a growth team that would ship bad products. Like
Mhm.
by bad product meaning stuff that was not like focused on the consumer experience. So I realized pretty early that like I needed to bring over what I would call like the best of breed tactics and strategies from Facebook, but marry that with the really exceptionally high bar for the consumer experience that Kevin and Mikey had.
Mhm.
Right.
Mhm.
And so like that meant, not being nearly as aggressive as Facebook would be with kind of growth strategies, and
Mhm.
be willing to leave kind of like, for lack of a better phrase, impact on the table,
Mhm.
because we felt like it created a more desirable, even an ideal consumer experience.
Gotcha.
Right. And so like, really making sure that like, keeping Kevin and Mikey in the loop step by step of what we were trying to do, helping them to like involving them as problem solvers for us as we were trying to like think about ways to like, unlock new opportunities within growth. But then also I spent a lot of time with our team in one-on-ones, and just like helping them to understand like what great product strategy and product execution looked like.
Just
And
super
that didn't scale
tactically.
at first. That didn't scale at first, but it eventually scaled.
Sure. Super tactically, like how did you do that? How did you show people sort of what that bar was? Was it just giving examples from your previous tools?
A little bit of that, but like that sometimes a lot of times it doesn't resonate. So like our first designer on growth is a woman named Anna Babayeva. She's amazing, just amazing designer. She was the first growth designer at Instagram, and she, I think this was actually her first job out of college. She had done an internship at Spotify, had a great kind of like design sense, but like hadn't really worked on product design at scale, and certainly hadn't worked on growth. So like I just made time for her every day, like 4 o'clock, 4:30, we sit down for like 30, 45 minutes, an hour, sometimes an hour and a half. And she would like, we would walk through the flows like of whatever the project was, right? So like she was obviously incorporated into our team meetings. We had clear product requirements that everyone could focus on. But as she was designing these things, there's always this kind of like tension of like making it overly beautiful versus overly practical. Right. And so growth people always want to make things overly practical while sacrificing kind of the aesthetic, right? And designers oftentimes want to make it overly beautiful while like sacrificing their like design, their practicality, right? And so it was like me talking through and like helping her to feel confident that I was supporting her design explorations, giving her feedback on like what are we trying to achieve and why does that matter and which trade-offs did I want to see versus what trade-offs does she want to see. And like really helping her to like have the space to explore, even if she didn't believe me. And if she believed that like this design made the most sense, all right, let's test that design, but let's test this other thing that I'm thinking about. And let's see which one actually works for our customers, right? And so like sometimes her designs worked well, and sometimes my design worked well. But it was like building that trust, and like it's the notion of like talking through things and sharing the context, right? And so like, you go through 3, 4, 5 months of this. At that point, Anna like really understood like how to think through the processes, how to think through, and so like her iteration cycles and her ability to design was just exponentially better, much faster. And then she was able to scale herself and really understand and start thinking more holistically about like the design systems, about the data, about the consumer problems, right? And so like, this type of thing I did with engineers, right? I did also, with our growth marketer, like, everyone like sharing the same context, but then obviously we had team meetings in which a lot of this stuff was reinforced. And so we were all like getting the depth of context, but all like kind of had shared context around what are we working on this week? Why does it matter? What are conditions of satisfaction?
Totally understood. So I think that that's really interesting in terms of how you bring that context into the team. Now, instead of a growth company, you're advising an early stage startup who has maybe 100 users, 1,000 users, 10,000 users. How do you pivot your advice and kind of tune your advice when you don't have quite as large of a population to experiment on?
It's a great question, and it's a hard one. I think one, you need to have comfort in not having like clear data, right? Like there's going to be a world that you're going to live in, especially early on, where you need to try things that don't scale, but like provide you with the initial, let's call it like activation energy, right? And so like if you're trying to scale a marketplace, you're going to be pretty scrappy to say like, how do we get initial demand for that marketplace, right? And if that's Uber and your equivalent for getting initial, or Lyft and your equivalent for getting initial demand is like, literally handing out flyers on the boardwalk of Santa Monica if you need to see stuff there, or like going to like local celebrations, or going into corporations and like recruiting, like making it known, or just like doing paid. But part of what you need to do is like you need to learn fast. You need to be okay with overspending within a certain budget and learning as fast as you can. And then like improving your systems and measurement over time.
So many people talk about focusing on power users. You've got a small population of people early on in your app who are really using it. They're really using everything. They're engaged. Maybe they're providing you a lot of feedback. Some of the advice that I've seen you give, and just in general, is you focus on adjacent users. Why are they important for growth?
Yeah, it's an interesting topic and question. So I wrote a piece about this called the adjacent user theory. It was on Andrew Chen's blog, and the thinking here is pretty simple, but like maybe not obvious. And so the simplicity here is that, like, look, if you think about the customer journey from awareness and intent through like actually using the product and becoming a power user, most product organizations focused on, I would guess the second half of that journey. Like
Mhm,
someone who's already using the product, how do you get them to use it more?
mhm,
Either more time spent, more share of wallet, more sessions, right? There's an equally important but often overlooked part of the customer journey, which is the part that the growth product teams focus on, which is like, how do you get people who have heard of your product to actually try the product, to have a good first experience, and how do you continue to optimize and improve that?
mm,
And so this is where adjacent users come in, because once people come on and they like on board and they try the product, if you can activate them, like they are now engaged, and the goal is to make them become a power user. But if you're in a hyper growth company, what tends to happen is, like, if you're growing 20% or 30%, 40% month over month, who your customer was 6 months ago is not who your customer is today.
mhm,
Right? They're like fundamentally different people.
mhm,
Right?
mhm,
Like your user base might even have turned over 100%.
mhm,
And so part of what's important is that you're constantly understanding who the adjacent user is. User, not who is your persona,
mhm,
but who's the person who's like next to your persona, who
mhm,
might be the person who's trying your product today.
mhm,
So in the
mhm,
world of Instacart, like, for example, their initial persona might have been a woman in her 30s or 40s who is tends to do a lot of the buying for the household, tends to be more kind of like economically, has more economic viability, is like less price sensitive, maybe lives in a city, right? And is willing to pay a premium for their time,
mhm,
right? Willing to pay a little bit more than they would in the grocery store in order to have the convenience. But a year later, a year and a half later, even 8 months later, that might mean that like your adjacent user might still be a woman who is in that same age range, but they may be either suburban,
mhm,
right, instead of in the city, or maybe a little bit more price sensitive.
mhm,
Right? And so it's these like adjacent kind of like distinguishers mean that they're not maybe ramping up in the same way. They're not activating in the same way.
mhm,
Maybe they're not activating because like the costs are too high, or maybe the delivery windows are too long because like
mhm,
we don't have the same density of shoppers in the suburbs as we do in like urban areas.
mhm,
And so like being able to understand who your persona is and think adjacent to that persona by different demographic categories, and constantly keeping an eye on like how your population evolves, helps you to make sense of what I would call like kind of cohort decline.
mhm,
So like,
mhm.
is a new cohort of users not converting in the same way? And what might be driving that? Right. And so
Gotcha.
you need to constantly be thinking about like new people who are onboarding, are they converting in the same way? And if they're not, like, what about the demographics of these new users is changing that may be something that you can explore why that's happening.
That's really interesting where you sort of start to take these dimensions and push them in one way or another. Um, can you adjust this advice to enterprise companies where the user and the buyer may be different? You've got your customer, but then within that, there's these kind of different constituents.
Yeah. So you mean from, sorry, did you say from an enterprise perspective?
Yeah, yeah, pivot from just pure consumer to maybe applying some of these lessons of adjacencies to the enterprise.
Yeah. I mean, so the enterprise is always harder because of this disconnect. I'd say, one thing that's important is that, like, for enterprise companies, they have like a team. So they, one, acknowledge internally that there are different jobs to be done by the team that's doing the sales and business development
Mhm,
than the team who's building the product for the customer.
mhm,
Right? And making sure that the team that is doing the sales and business development is one cross-functional, right?
mhm,
So you might have like a forward deploying engineering team or a solutions architect, or like someone on their business. It's like when these teams are like trying to close a deal, they really can understand what the feedback is and what the feature requests are and why they matter.
mhm,
And then, as they move into new kind of like verticals or industries or company sizes, they're being intentionally aware of what does that mean? What does the adjacency mean for the kind of requests that you're getting, right? Like, and so like if you're focused on, let's call it, it could be enterprise security for Fortune 100 companies. And then you start moving downwards towards like enterprise security for, it could be small, medium businesses. There's like different adjacencies for closing a deal, and which is different than like the adjacencies of like the end user. So like in the company, what is the user doing who's going to use the product, and how does their workflow change? And so as an enterprise team, like you want to have people who actually do customer research with the teams that do the work, that are actually using it, because you want to understand their usage and their satisfaction and make sure that like retention happens because there's just widespread satisfaction with the product.
Sure.
And in addition to that, you also want to have some awareness of like, what does it mean to change your sales cycle from the biz dev perspective?
Sure. Just getting super tactical for a minute, either on the consumer or enterprise front. How do you identify those key points of friction? Is it data and cohorts? Is it interviews? Is it, just some real tactical nuggets?
How do we identify the? Can you repeat the question?
How do you identify the key points of friction that may lead to cohort decay? You've got these adjacent users. How do you get at what's bothering them?
Yep. Yeah, it's a great question. So I think a way of thinking about this is each product has some key behaviors that like really are important for either like helping people to find the initial core value of the product, right? Or helping them to continue to stay involved with the product. So like you can think about it from like, let's talk about Slack, for example. I've never worked at Slack, but like I've had some friends who work there, and I would hypothesize that like from an initial value creation standpoint, you need to get a certain number of, you need the person. So like Slack is an n equals 1 and an n greater than 1 type of product, right? Like Slack is like this, Discord is like this, Atlassian, Jira is like this. When I say n equals 1, it's like there's a person that needs to come in and do the heavy lifting, set up this space, make it ready for everyone else, and then invite a bunch of other people. And then the n greater than 1 is like everyone else who's joining needs to like enter the space and like understand what it's used for, feel like it makes sense, and want to communicate, right? And so in that mental model, right, like you need like what you're looking for is like the rate at which the n equals 1 person is actually successfully setting up the space and inviting people, right? And then there's like for the n greater than 1 set of people, the rate at which they come in and actually like engage and like tag, comment, like add information, and like continue to invite others, right? And so what you're looking for in that situation, when you realize that that is kind of like the fundamental foundation for success, what you're looking for is cohort decay of those two behaviors, right? Like, and so like, like for this vintage of users, it could be this vintage, right? Like people who signed up from like March and April versus people who signed up in October, November. Or you can cut it by like people who are signing up who are coming from big enterprises versus small, medium businesses, right? Like you can cut it from like you can look at it by geo. So like, what is cohort decay in the US, like Canada versus like Western Europe during this time period? And you can start like finding patterns. But what you might see is that like, hey, we actually have no cohort decay across enterprise, but where our like of every certain size, but where our cohort decay actually happens is from a geo perspective. Right? Or the cohort decay is actually happening post-COVID because we have more people looking for solutions. So there's like lower intent people who are joining. Right? And so like it's one, you've got to figure out like, well, what are the fundamentals of the business that we are like are kind of determinants of success? And then two, mapping that to like the kind of like the different cuts that are going to help you to key in on like where and why the cohorts are decaying. And then you've got to like dig in and figure out how to solve it.
That's really interesting. The cohort analysis is so critical. I just know in my role as an investor, we use it all the time, and it's always very interesting talking to founders about their cohorts and what they're seeing. I want to talk now and move a little bit farther through that user journey. We've got our adjacent users who we're starting to convert, we're starting to pull in, and they're on their way to becoming power users. Again, pulling an example from your background, we're stepping into Instacart now. You talked a little bit about how you defined your power users. How did you get to that set of data? How did you understand that these were your power users to begin with?
Yeah, that makes sense. So I think with Instacart's example, I think is very, I would say like very typical of a lot of companies. It was basically first we had to define what success looked like on the platform. And then kind of like bucketing different types of users based on their frequency of engagement based on what success looks like. So for Instacart, success is not, opening the app, right? Because that's what it would be on Instagram, but on Instacart, it's actually like making a purchase, right? And so success here is, let's call it like monthly active orders, right? Like, you could have said bi-weekly orders, but like, we chose monthly as like the longest frequency we were willing to support because, maybe, in the first week you order from Instacart, the second week you go for the farmer's market.
Yeah.
Right. And so like, if you're ordering every month, like you're retained. And so when we understood monthly active orders, then the question became like, all right, so how do you define core versus casual versus power users? Right. And like a casual might be like you order once a month. Core is like you order twice a month. And power might be you order like 3 or more times. Just to make it simple.
Yeah.
Right. So then it's like, all right, now like let's go and see like who is ordering 3 or more times a month. Right. Like let's break that down. What is the distribution of those people? What, like distribution in terms of number, in terms of geo, in terms of like AOV. Let's understand like, what demographics can we glean from those people? Right? And then, you can like go from there to try to figure out like, how do we think about the persona of who is our, like, who is our power user and like, how has that changed over time?
Sure. That's interesting. And that's, kind of one defined project. You've got your power users and I would imagine you evolve them. But again, getting super tactical, put us in your shoes as the growth leader. What was your week like? What data did you look at? What was useful? What wasn't useful? Just what was your day-to-day cadence like?
Yeah, I mean, so it's a good question. It's a hard question because every week is a little bit different. I'd say, the things that I care about in general in a company that's like, I call Instacart like a mature company, a more mature company. Though certainly not public, and Instagram certainly was one, just like looking at like I would call baseline metrics, right? So like every day understanding like, how did we do the last day? Is anything wrong? 50% of growth is like keeping the engine running. Right? So what I mean by that is like, there's a notion of growth accounting, which is like our net growth is basically equal to new users plus resurrected users minus return users.
Yeah.
And so, if your new users drops precipitously, then, it's going to have a massive impact on your net growth. And so you just need to make sure that like nothing is breaking, nothing is changing. So like an example is like when I was at Instagram, I walked in the office one morning and our net growth was like super negative. Where it was usually like hundreds of thousands a day, it was like negative like 300,000. And when we looked into the growth accounting, it turns out that like our new users had gone to 0. Right. And so like we had to spend a lot of that day figuring out why did our new users go to 0? Turns out that there was some technical issue that like stopped people from creating new accounts. Right. And so like 50% of the job is make sure the engine keeps running because like it doesn't matter how many more things, bells and whistles you add. If like your engine doesn't run, then like your net growth is going to like tank.
Yeah.
So that was one part of the job. I think another part of the job was like really kind of like understanding what are our key targets and making sure that like our projects are moving forward. So if we had projects around like, testing new, like building new infrastructure to try new, marketing and support marketing efforts, or trying new retention and engagement campaigns. You're spending a lot of time like defining those and making sure that they were moving forward. And then I'd say probably like 30% of my time was like building alignment horizontally and upwards. Probably could have been more of my time, but like, that is always important. It's like, how do you make sure that people are aligned with what you're doing and telling the right story? And then probably like another 20% of my time is just recruiting.
Yeah, sure.
Constantly trying to build a new team, build out the team because like it just gives you leverage.
Yeah, Sure. So, wow, 20% of your time on recruiting. That's impressive. Were there activities that weren't as useful? You felt just kind of burned your time, but weren't always as productive to move things forward?
Um, yeah, I mean, I bucket those, and there's like, if you think about the kind of the notion of the Eisenhower box, there's like important and urgent.
Hmm.
And the things that were generally not as important were not important to focus on, the things that were just like urgent but not important,
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
right? These are things that like felt like mini fires, but like ultimately kind of like, you could delegate
Yeah,
and move
sure.
elsewhere, which, often tended to be things like, hey, there's like this minor detail, what do we need to do, right? And like
Hmm.
80% of the time it didn't matter,
Hmm.
and 20% of the time it did, right? And so like,
Hmm.
making sure that the team really understood the principles of what we were trying to do,
Hmm.
right? And understood the kind of the success outcomes so they can make those decisions themselves.
Hmm. Hmm.
So like the stuff that you really want to focus on is the important stuff and the important and urgent stuff. That
Okay.
was like the projects that were really going to move the needle,
Yeah.
and making sure that those were executed really well.
Gotcha. That's helpful. I want to talk about, again, like we did with the adjacent users, talking about your power users and how you identify them, applying that to the enterprise. Um, do you treat companies as a power user? You've got a power organization, or do you treat individuals within that as the power user?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Um, I mean, you can do both. Whether you should do both, because I think it's a different conversation,
Hmm.
right? So, like, let's talk about the former, right? Like, think about companies as power organizations. Um, this is common, and I think it can be healthy, right?
Hmm.
So, like, again, going back to the notion of like a Slack, right? Like,
Yeah.
I'm assuming that like in the early days of Slack, there wouldn't be companies that were like bigger companies that were really kind of like I would call them like bellwethers for other companies that you want to treat as power organizations, because, you know, for them to use the product effectively, they would give you feedback that would change like your product prioritization. So imagine Slack in the early days got like, a customer like, I don't know, maybe it's a Google, maybe it's an Apple or something like that to use it. But like getting a lot of feedback from this organization and understanding why they were certain requesting features would help unlock a lot of utility for a bunch of other companies
Hmm.
that maybe weren't on the platform already. And so in a lot of ways, it's really important to understand who your power users are, and like what value they're delivering to you, and make sure that you are supporting that, but like not over indexing.
Hmm.
I think
Hmm.
where you find challenges is like the power users within a company can often push really aggressively, be the loudest voices in the room for building features that like only like 1% of the customers use.
Sure.
And you've got to like figure out how to kind of like find the right balance there. Because if you don't think about those users, then eventually they will go on and find the next thing. And oftentimes those are the users who like champion new products within an organization. Right.
Sure.
So you can't totally ignore them, right? But you can't do all the things that they want to do either, because
Yeah.
you'll end up creating like a very niche product.
Gotcha. Gotcha. And so that's where your, I guess, adjacent users within the enterprise come from. You don't want to
Yeah.
just have a community of power users. You want to start having these adjacencies.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. Um, if we look sort of towards the future, right? And I want to get to some audience Q&A. I've had some come across in the chat, and if anybody else has any other questions, please use the Zoom Q&A function. But in some circles, growth can have a bad rap, right? At a high level, how do you think about building the kinds of products that add value to users, that don't create ethical issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. The bad rap on growth is it's a challenging one, because I think, if you kind of zoom out and think about the last 10 to 15 years of product development, there was, mid 2000s or so, there was like a whole kind of revolution in just even understanding what product market fit was.
Hmm.
Right. So
Hmm.
like we just assume that that's true, but like that wasn't even a thing until like Eric Ries really like made it a
Yeah.
thing. And then post product market fit, there was like, all right, we have product market fit. So then how do you actually get this thing to be massive? And Facebook was kind of the innovator around doing that. They really built the first consumer product growth team. But for better or for worse, they never really shared their thinking and their learnings. So it kind of left this void of people trying to like basically create a dialogue of like what it means to grow a product. And became these memes of like growth is basically slapping a button somewhere, or like, like really tricking people into doing these flows. And that's not really what it's about. What it is about is like really understanding the barriers to adoption in the product, and decreasing decreasing friction to those barriers. Right? And that is really the focus. And so if you want to do great growth, what it means is like you are solving real consumer jobs, real problems, with a notion in mind of like what are the barriers to adoption for these customers, and specifically for these newer customers. Right. So an example of this is like, there is you think about like onboarding flows, right? Like classic onboarding flow, you've got to give some kind of contact point, an email address or a phone number. Right? Like you've got to choose some kind of username in the product. Right? You've got to give some kind of like identifying information, profile, bio, picture, something like that. These things feel straightforward, but there's oftentimes a lot of friction. Right? So like, when I say friction, meaning what does it mean to have a username in this product? Right? Like we spent a lot of time improving the username step in Instagram because people are very reticent to choose a username because they don't actually understand what the product is, and they don't want to be pigeonholed to a username that they may or may not be able to change.
Totally.
Right. And so like this is a real like point of friction, and like people assume that it's not true, but like I lived this story, right? So like I was early on Snapchat, and when I signed up for Snapchat, I'm like, what is this Snapchat thing? And I just typed in a username, which was like hot mess or something like that, with like the E is a 3. And I'm like, whatever, I can change it later, right? Of course, Snapchat doesn't let you change it. And then now my Snapchat handle is like hot mess. And I'm just like, shit, I never should do this again, right? So like every time I hear the user, so now I've like systematized all of my usernames across all platforms because I'm like traumatized by that one event, right? And so like, and this is me, and I'm way more tech savvy than like, my aunt who's 65 or my uncle who's in his 70s, right? And so it's really important to like say like, okay, well, what is the job that people are trying to do here? And so what you'll find is you go through the Instagram, for example, sign up flow is, we recommend a username for you. We make it simple for you, right? If you don't like that one, we give you one tap to generate a new one. We tell you very clearly like that you can change your username later on. We give you an option to like change it in that moment, manually. But like the default isn't manual where we have to validate every keystroke to make sure that that username is available. Because that's actually a bad experience. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Right. And so like what you're trying to do with growth, and this is just one example, but like there's so many parts of your product where it becomes challenging, and you've got to think about it, right? Like how do you make sure that the search results are actually making sense? Right. Like, and so like thinking about the friction that's involved in that experience, and like actually like building a better experience that is like less frictionful but solving a real job is what growth is all about. And like if as long as you're focused on like solving real jobs for consumers, then you're less likely to run into ethical issues.
Sort of differentiating what's adding value to the user versus what may add value for the organization, for your company. What are you focused on now? What are you spending most of your time doing, and what does the next year or so look like for you?
Yeah, great question. So what am I focused on now? I'm focused on a bunch of things. So I'm focused on, I advise a handful of companies. These companies are companies that, I've spent some time on, and I believe in the founders, and, I want to help them I love like partnering with companies. So I want to help them to like, kind of think through some of their strategy, and like solve real problems. I joined the board I'm on the board with you, of a Series A company who's in the middle of a pivot from a B2B to B2C kind of thinking. So spending some time there with them. I'm also like kind of in the works, kind of not finalized yet, of joining like a public company, their board, that's like kind of in the social space. So excited to like kind of get that going. And like, I'm like thinking of joining a company in the very near future. So like kind of like finalizing, trying to work through that. And we'll probably announce that soon. And so it's a lot of like advising investing. For me, the last year, like many people, were just like surviving kind of COVID. I have 2 young kids at home. It was like a mess and like, try to do work and have kids with no childcare for most of the year.
Mhm.
And also my wife works full time. And so like a lot of it was just kind of creating the space for our family to like be okay during this
Yep.
kind of unprecedented.
Totally understand that. I mean, it gives you such an interesting vantage point. If you look at the future of consumer growth or enterprise growth, where are the big opportunities for either new companies or for existing companies to expand into?
Yeah. I mean, like I don't have a crystal ball. If I did, I would certainly be a VC. I believe in a few things. So like some of my personal thesis is like, I think, I said this to some VCs a couple of years ago and they honestly laughed at me. I think social is far from dead, right? Like new paradigms of social, I think will I think like emerge. And so I think social audio is obviously one of those.
Mhm.
I mean, I kind of fundamentally also believe in the unbundling of the bookmarks bar of Facebook. And so Facebook has way more products than they can feature on their home screen, events, groups, town halls, a bunch of other stuff. And these are products that I think Facebook does a good job at, but like I think you could probably have a 10x better experience if you did it separately, if you could figure out how to bootstrap the graph. So I think I would not be surprised to see more kind of opportunities there. I fundamentally believe that like ed tech is like, it's something that hasn't had its moment and needs to. Like I'm super excited for Class Dojo and Sam and the team there. I think they're building something special. I expect to see like a few more kind of companies in that space really make sense. And honestly, I think that we've probably like I've never really believed in fintech, but I'm starting to believe in it. Right, like I think people are way more comfortable now with like the notion of online banking.
Yeah.
I think people are starting to see the commoditization of banking services, and like kind of like the mass adoption of like value added services from a banking perspective. I think will change. So like change fintech, I think ed tech, I think new social formats will arise. And then from an enterprise perspective, I'd say I'm less aware of, but I do think that there's like a bunch of like kind of SaaS tools that like still have yet to be created. Like, there was just like, when I was at Facebook, there was just a bunch of incredible internal tools that they created that just like don't exist. So think like the Asanas of today, right? Like what's the Asana of today that doesn't exist, right? Think about like, what's the V2 of Figma that doesn't exist, like mobile first version of Figma. And everything in between, like a customer, like there's a company in the UK called Prolific that's basically building a marketplace for like customer research. Like there's probably like great high quality user research at scale that you could spin up overnight that doesn't exist. Right? So I think that there's like, really interesting opportunities in these kind of like platforms for workflows. And that just don't kind of like do what we need them to do today.
Sure. That's interesting. Well, my VC brain is going off, so I'll shut that down right quick, and let's pivot to audience Q&A, since that's what people actually want to hear about. Talk about, you're doing A/B testing of different approaches. Talk about just tactically how to do it. How do you pick your sample size? How do you pick your ranges? How long do you sort of monitor this before you decide you have a signal on it?
I mean, this is hard. It really depends on the platform and the size of like your user base, right? But I think in general, you definitely want to, you want to pick an audience size in which you will find statistical significance as fast as possible. You want to, I think, limit the complexity of your testing until you really have like a more sophisticated, team and testing platform. And you want to make sure that like your test design really like is like super airtight. Oftentimes I find that like some of the biggest mistakes in testing or A/B testing is that they have one hypothesis, but they're exposing the test to the wrong audience, right? Or they're like testing like the thing that they're testing doesn't actually support the hypothesis they're trying to validate or invalidate, right? So it's like, just keep it simple. If it means that you have like 100,000 people on your platform and you need to test like a 20 bucket size in order to get statistical significance within a week, then that's what you do. I mean, work with your data science, find the minimum viable. And if it means that like, I find it's better instead of doing like an ABCDE test, right? Like where it's going to take you like 8 weeks to get answers, like just do the A/B test and get the answers in a week, like on the riskiest assumption, and do another A/B test and get answers in another week from there.
Gotcha. And what about when n is small, when your overall user n is very small? How do you approach that when you can't get to
Don't,
statistical significance?
and don't do it.
Don't do
Like,
it.
don't do the A/B testing. Like,
Okay.
have a hypothesis, document the decision you make.
Yep.
Like, maybe keep a holdout group over time, maybe not. Like, but I think this is where, when you get to a certain size, you need to revisit past assumptions
Sure.
and past decisions, right? But you need to document those decisions and not assume that they're the right just because like it seems to work at the time.
Just write them down so you can revisit them.
Right.
How is the environment for driving growth change? Consumer apps, and in the enterprise, the market's gotten bigger, but everything's gotten more mature. It's gotten more crowded. Back in the mid 2000s, you could just kind of start throwing stuff out there, and there was it was all new market. What doesn't work anymore? What do we need to do now that we didn't have to?
Yeah, I mean, this is a tricky question. I think people actually, so growth is hard, but like you certainly shouldn't overcomplicate it, right? Like there's billions of users in the world, hundreds of millions in the US. I think there is I'd say, compared to 10 years ago, like there's a lot, obviously many more apps, way more competition. And so part of it's like, you need to have a thesis of who your customer is and have a clear value proposition. Like something that's differentiated, that's like value added, that really resonates to a real job that people are trying to solve. Whereas I think 10 years ago, like there's so few solutions that like you can get away with like not having even this level of rigor.
Gotcha. So very,
Right?
very precise and targeted understanding of what you're actually going to solve for your customers.
Right. And like trying doesn't mean that you like limit the scope of either your testing, whether that's paid marketing or viral stuff. Like it just means that like you have a clear customer hypothesis and a clear problem hypothesis that you're trying to solve for them.
Sure.
And then as you learn, you pivot on, well, was that the right customer and the wrong problem that you're solving? Or was it the right problem but the wrong customer? Right. And then just like work through it methodically.
Sure. This one you can choose to demur on because it may be too close to your particular background, but companies like Instacart in the pandemic had huge tailwinds for very specific global macro reasons. As we sort of look at the landscape out there, how do we determine which ones have gotten really good at growth versus just had a massive tailwind that is now starting to dissipate and they may sort of start to return to earth?
Yeah, I mean, this is impossible to know without being inside one of these companies.
Sure.
But like, I guess the thing that kind of matters here is how much of this tailwind is actually coming and doing like the core behavior for the product versus doing like I would call it like asymmetric behavior.
Sure.
So for example, like at an Instacart, like, what you kind of need to understand is like how much of this company, how much of the people who are coming during COVID are actually ordering groceries, like, across all of the major categories, like dairy, meats, breads, like produce, that kind of stuff, versus how much of them are just like prepping for like, the next COVID wave, right? They come on and it's like they're just buying toilet paper and water and like hand sanitizer and like that's it, right? Right? Because like that is going to be an indicator, directional indicator that like when this is over, they're not going to stay.
Gotcha.
Versus like, if the vintage is like, actually doing the core behavior, then it's like, well, that actually could be sticky, right? Like they're seeing repeated value and they're like actually changing the real behavior.
Sure.
And so similarly, like, if you're thinking about this for other platforms, it's like, how much are you seeing people do the core behavior versus doing like on Twitter, are you seeing people sign up and only follow news on COVID? We're seeing people sign up and actually build a real graph, like across a lot of different categories and really engaging and liking and retweeting, right? Like, and how likely is it that they're going to stick because of that?
Sure. That's really interesting. Well, we're going to wrap it up so people have a few minutes to get off to their next thing, including yourself. Thank you so much for spending time with us. Everybody on, thank you for joining us. Please submit feedback to feedback.cloudcitymeetup.com. You can find Bangaly on Twitter at I am Bangaly, and it sounds like that's a normed username across all platforms now.
Except for Snapchat.
Except for Snapchat. So everybody, thank you very much, Bangaly. Really appreciate your time today.
Of course, thank you for having me. It was fun.